Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, salam. Welcome everybody to MACFEST 2025 again. And today's event is the architecture event. I bet a lot of you were waiting for this event. I know I have. So today's host is Mustafa from the Islamic Travels. Those of you who have been on MACFEST Heritage Tours, they probably know that name very well. Mustafa is the co-founder of Islamic Travels. He's responsible for business development, partner relations, organizing all the wonderful events. This is the company that was established more than 12 years ago with the aim of providing holistic travel experiences guided by Islamic principles. In recent years, they have organized trips to destinations as diverse as Bosnia, Azerbaijan, Peru, and South Africa. Mustafa holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's degree in petroleum engineering, and he has a strong interest in languages, geopolitics, and Islamic history. And he's been fortunate enough to travel to over 75 countries. Welcome, Mustafa. Welcome, Eric. Before we start today, I just wanted to remind everybody, if you have any questions or you would like to share any thoughts on today's topic, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A portal. We will pick them up towards the end of the event. And just a little reminder that we are still accepting the Arts Award submissions until midnight today. It's the last day today, so if you're an artist or a creative and you would like to take part in the competition, please put your submissions. Submission process is free. You just go to MACFEST website and you go to the Arts Awards page. Over to you, Mustafa.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna, for the introduction. It gives me real pleasure to be involved in today's discussion, and this topic is something that I've kept at heart for many years, and the travels that I've been fortunate to be involved in have given me some insight into the Islamic architecture. But I'm certainly hoping to learn more from our special guest, Eric Broug. And so I'll say a few words about our guest here. He's an author, educator, and artist who's been specializing in Islamic geometric design for more than 25 years. Eric holds a master's degree in the history of Islamic art and architecture from SOAS in London. As well as leading workshops and giving lectures around the world, he's a consultant to various educational institutions and design projects, particularly in the Middle East, but also beyond this region. He's written a number of books, including Islamic geometric patterns, Islamic geometric design, and an Islamic design workbook as well. But his most recent publication, his masterpiece, as we may refer to it, is Islamic Architecture, a World History, that was completed last year. And this amazing piece of work shows Islamic architecture and the influences of Islamic architecture on a global scale, all the way up to the 21st century. And as Eric will mention, a lot of the work that's out there does go into detail about art and architecture, but it tends to sort of peter out around the sort of colonial period, maybe the 17th and 18th centuries, and there isn't much out there that takes us to today. And so what Eric has done is he's collated information both chronologically and spatially to sort of give us more of an insight as to what there is out there. And so he'll be covering places as diverse as South America, Northern Europe, North America, Africa, and East Asia. So, you know, as will be evident from today's discussion, he's very passionate about the creative side of things and the educational opportunities that design traditions afford. And Islamic design and architecture is one such area that he has a lot of experience in, and I think we're all very keen to learn more about. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our special guest, Eric Broug.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you, MACFEST, for inviting me again. I'm going to share my screen. Just a moment. There we go. So today, I want to talk about Islamic architecture and my book about Islamic architecture. As Mustafa said, if you have questions, save them until the end or put them in the chat, and then we'll try and deal with all of them. So this is the cover of my book. Maybe some of you have it. It's a door in Cairo. And there's a whole story about not just the door itself, but also how the photo of this door ended up on the front of my book. But I'll talk about that in a little bit later. So you might know my little book, or the one on the left, Islamic Geometric Patterns. That's one that I wrote in 2008, and which has been going for a long time. There's a revised edition now, and that book really shows you how to draw patterns with a compass and a ruler. And funnily enough, every time I write a book, I think, okay, I'm finished. I'm never going to write anything else because I don't have anything else to write about. And then a little while later, an idea comes and then it turns into a new book. So every single time that happens. Yeah, so Islamic geometric design has been my thing for decades, really, and still is. But it's been a privilege for me to be able to write something about Islamic architecture. It was just, it's what I studied at SOAS, as Mustafa said. It's something that's very close to my heart. So to make a beautiful book about that was really, well, an honor. I also like to make things. So this is in Dewsbury. We finished this in 2017, I think. It's the Zakaria Educational Center. And it's a new building, purpose-built, and they asked me if I could design something to go on the facade of their building. And I said, yes, I think I can. And we ended up making this out of water jet cut ceramic tiles. So it's very big. As you can see, it's 4 by 9 meters. And it's a Moroccan pattern from a madrasa in Meknes from the 15th century. And it was an interesting project because, as with all of these community projects, there's a lot of people who've donated money and everybody has a view of what they want it to be. So I really tried to design something that would appeal to the older generation and to the younger generation as well. So, for example, by using non-gloss tiles instead of shiny tiles, and using different colors, it becomes a bit more contemporary as well. So it's one of those projects where a group of people come together, they work together, project was finished, and that's it. It was really us being brought together to make this happen, and it was a marvelous project. These are 2 pictures from my book. I've captioned all the photos today, so that's well, I don't have to say it every single time, but also that you can take notes, because there are so many buildings that I think you will not have seen before, and that's also what my talk is about a little bit. So the one on the left is in Georgia, in Tbilisi, which used to have a lot of bathhouses, and then of course this one is designed to look like Persian architecture with that arch and with the little mini minarets supposedly on the corners. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about before I start is, if you think about Islamic architecture and how you can approach the subject, there's more than one way to do it. And the way I studied Islamic architecture in an academic environment at SOAS is the approach is really that you look at eras, right? So, for example, the Mamluk era in Egypt, in Cairo, that's from 1250 to 1510. And the Mamluks were, for me personally, a real favorite. I wrote my dissertation at SOAS on the Mamluks. They were so good at Islamic geometric designs, and they were so good at making beautiful buildings and designing buildings that had to fit into a pre-existing urban fabric. And there's all sorts of interesting aspects to their architecture, not just what you see, but also how architecture serves as a way to demonstrate loyalty to a ruler, and how patterns do that as well. So it's a fascinating subject. The picture on the left is the same door as the one on the cover of my book, as you might recognize. But that's typically how Islamic architecture is taught. You look at an era, Mamluks, Safavids, it's the same, Marinids in Morocco. So that's one approach. And it has advantages, but it also has disadvantages, which I'll talk about a little bit. Another way to do it is to look at Islamic architecture by building type, where you write about mosques or madrasas or minarets, and it allows you to group history and theory together in a way. And I recently wrote something in Dutch in this book where I was asked to write a chapter on Islamic architecture, and I did it by building type, because this particular book is for the Dutch and Flemish market. So I thought, well, I have to make it relevant as well. You know, if I'm just going to write a chapter about Islamic architecture and I just write about things from the past, how is that relevant to people who can see mosques in towns and cities in Belgium and Holland? You know, I mean, that's interesting to know more about. So doing it by building type allows you to cast your net much wider. You know, it gives you a way to talk about, you know, a new mosque in Rotterdam that serves the Turkish community, or a converted primary school in a village in Holland which has a sort of short stubby minaret. It's a better approach in that way. I've also written the name at the bottom of the photographer who did the cover, who might be worth looking up. I really love his work. I recommended to the publisher that they use his cover for this book, and they did. So Marwan Bassiouni is, well, he lives in Holland, and he does this great thing where he goes inside mosques in Europe and takes a photo from inside outside. And it's just so fascinating, because you can see these different landscapes. Here you can see a green field, but you can also see cityscapes or townscapes. And he's done a series in Holland. He's done a series of such views in Switzerland. He's been up to the north of England to do the same. He's on Instagram, so look him up. His work is really great. Anyway, so that's one approach. Second approach. Third approach is the way I've done it in my book, which is by country. And for the purposes of the book, it was really the best approach, because I considered all sorts of options. But when my publisher asked me if I thought I could write a book about Islamic architecture, I thought, well, I think I can, but how? You know, and what would it be, and how could it be original, and how could it be a book for the 21st century, where it can be a global history, where you can also write about Islamic architecture in the US or in Japan or in Poland or Ecuador or whatever. You know, Islamic architecture is global, so how can you show that? And doing it by country is the obvious solution, and it's also most interesting for readers, I thought. So that's how I did my book. And equally, if you study Islamic architecture at university, certainly in the past, and it's still a little bit the case, it's easy to think that most of the interesting things happened in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, South Asia, and that it stopped being interesting in the 17th century, basically. And of course, that's not true at all. You know, it's interesting now as well. So the book, I also wanted to include 21st century architecture, really to cast my net wide and to not choose buildings solely based on their historical importance. Because if I did that, then I would end up with a book full of the Tokapi Palace, the Alhambra, Isfahan, all the usual suspects, and there wouldn't be any room left over for anything else. So I thought, I'm just going to choose the buildings that have the most visual interest. That's going to be the criterion, and that's what I applied. So that gave me an excuse to also include obscure buildings, as long as they were beautiful or interesting, or both. So I also want to talk a little bit about how I ended up writing this book, and also what didn't make it into this book. So the cover on the right is the German cover. So I write my books for a publisher called Thames and Hudson, who are great, the best, I think. As an author, there are two things about which you don't have any say, which is the title of the book and the cover of the book, because it's too important to leave to the author, basically. You know, it's a commercial product. It really has to work, not just as a book on the shelf, but also as a small photo on Amazon, for example. The German publisher wanted a different cover, so they chose a different photo from inside the book. And the same is true with the Japanese publisher. They also chose something else. So in a book on Islamic architecture, there are of course plenty of buildings that have to be in there. You know, it's inconceivable to write a book on Islamic architecture without having the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus in it, or Mecca, of course. So then the question for me is, well, what is a beautiful photo that I can find that I can use rather than showing a familiar perspective? Let me see if I can find a photo that shows it in a way that people have not seen before. Or let me find a photo that's simply a beautiful photo, full stop. So for example, with the Umayyad Mosque, there's many perspectives that I could show. And I've got two photos from the same building actually in the book. And with Mecca as well, I think, well, what is the photo that I could use that would really tell a story? Because there's plenty of books that have a photo of the Kaaba. You know, everybody knows what that looks like. So that when I saw this photo, I thought, well, this is just fantastic. I love this photo because you see the Kaaba and you can see people, and you can get a bit of a better understanding of how people interact when they're there, what happens when they're there. So I wanted the pictures to tell a story, and you know, every now and then I would find a photo, and I would just be so delighted that I found a really good photo, and you know, these photos have ended up in the book. Same with this one, Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. Very famous, the masterpiece of Ottoman architecture. Photographed many times, but I've never seen a photo like this before. So when I found this on the website of a Turkish press association, I thought, fantastic, such a great photo. You know, you see the building really well. It's also a little bit romantic. It's almost a view of a bird flying over this, or an angel, if you will, flying over this mosque. It's great. So I think for the book, there's 350 photos in there. I think without exaggeration, I looked at about 500,000 photos on photo agency websites, right? So I didn't take any of these photos because, you know, photographer is a trade, it's a profession. And, you know, my profession is to write and to make books. Other people's profession is to make beautiful photos. So my job is really to go through websites like Getty Images, Alamy, there's many others, and just not to find a good photo, but the best photo of a particular building. And sometimes you come across photos where you think, well, this is such a important and evocative, important place, evocative photo, that it has to go in there. So this is in the Dome of the Rock. This is underneath the Dome of the Rock. Well of Souls. I've forgotten the Arabic name at the moment, but I can look it up if people want to know. It has Islam's oldest mihrab, there's a separate photo also in the book showing this. And you know, this place has not been photographed very often, let alone published in a book. So there was an opportunity to do that, and I was just grateful that we found a really good photo like this. And then a good photo allows me to add a caption that then tells a little story about it as well. So that was also the thing with the book, that there's a lot of big photos and all the photos have captions, but there's not like 20 pages of text per chapter, because I think a lot of people don't read that. A big photo book like this, people look at the photos. If they love the photo, they'll read the captions. If the captions are interesting, they might read the chapter in that order. A lot of people might not have English as a first language, all these things. So I thought, if I can be concise and have concise captions for photos, then maybe that's the best way to educate people. Al-Aqsa Mosque, photo taken by a really good friend of mine, a Jordanian photographer called Bashar Taba, who he's a great photographer. And you know, when you have photos from Jerusalem, it's always Dome of the Rock, and of course justifiably so, but you don't see a lot of photos of Al-Aqsa Mosque. So a lovely photo like this, I think this is great to include. This photo almost made it onto the cover of the book, but in the end the publisher chose something else. But also a photo that tells a story. You know, it makes it easy to imagine that you're there. That's really what I wanted to do with the photos as well. You know, not have an architecture book where there's no people in it, but have a book where you can imagine that you're actually looking at the picture in situ. So with the Tokapi Palace, then the question is, well, what photo am I going to choose for the Tokapi Palace, right, in Istanbul? There are so many photos I could choose. And then I came across this, and I think just as a composition and showing the skill and the ornateness of the tiling and the windows, and also the story of these kiosks. You know, this is where Ottoman crown princes were locked up for well, sometimes for decades, until they were ready to become ruler, or to prevent them from trying to assassinate their family members. It's there's a grim reason for building these things, but the things that they built, these apartments, were absolutely beautiful. I also wanted to look at details, because for me, one of the wonderful things about Islamic architecture is the level of detail, not just in geometric patterns, but in so many other things. So this little birdhouse on Yeni Valide Mosque in Istanbul, for example, I just think is wonderful. You know, there's a tradition in Ottoman architecture, and you can see this when you go to Istanbul or to other mosques, where you see, for example, in the public square in front, in the courtyard, there might be a stone floor which has a little circle or a square that's been deepened out so that rainwater can accumulate there, which is for birds to have a little drink. You know, and the same with this mini mosque on the wall is for birds. Just delightful. The mosque in Diyarbakir, also interesting, you know, with this really complex knotted column. You know, they could have done a simple column, but they really gave themselves a very difficult challenge, and just to make the mosque more beautiful. Sometimes photos present themselves on my search that I think, well, this is just so fantastic. This photo really needs to go in there. What quite often happens with this is that the photographer will take a photo and just say a mosque in Ethiopia, which is not enough information for me to include it in a book. So sometimes it requires a lot of research to figure out, well, where is this? What is this? And the same with this. I really had to work hard just to get enough information to write 200 words on this photo. And the story is that it's in the middle of the desert, and people who travel here, they all bring some bits of wood with them, so that this mosque can be maintained and can be built. You know, if you think about it, you're traveling across the desert, you're carrying this wood with you that on a cold night in the desert, maybe you'd rather burn to stay warm, but you don't. You just carry it with you to take it here. It's in Cairo. Just a beautiful photo. You know, sometimes that's reason enough to include it. You know, beautiful colors, beautiful composition. Yeah, so photos where you can see people interacting with the building. There's a whole story to tell about this mosque as well in Jenne. What is also weird when you study Islamic architecture, that you don't get a lot of articles or research about Southeast Asia, you know. And you think a country like Indonesia, where I grew up as a child, by the way, a country like Indonesia, what can I read about Islamic architecture in Indonesia? Hardly anything. And the same is true for Thailand and the Philippines and Malaysia. And it's odd, right? So I thought there's a real challenge here, a real opportunity here, just to change that narrative a little bit and to show things that people are not familiar with. This is in Bahrain, in the Bait al-Quran Museum. huge skylight, really beautiful, beautifully made by a British artist, by the way. This is in Italy. It's a castle that was renovated in the 19th century, and there are dozens of rooms that are all obviously inspired by Islamic architecture. Really exuberant. It was really hard to choose a single photo because all the rooms are just total knockouts. They have a Instagram account, by the way, Castello di Samazzano. It's a really good account. Just follow them on Instagram, and they show these, well, great photos of all these rooms. I also wanted to show things that people had, well, they were just unusual, right? Mosque on the left, the Barbie Mosque, as I have heard it referred to. It's extraordinary, right? I mean, if you want the story, then it's in the book, or you can ask me in the chat. On the right, it's a tobacco factory in Germany that made cigarettes with the brand Salam Aleikum. And in the early 20th century, if you took the train into Dresden, the first thing you saw coming into the city was this factory shaped like a mosque, and big neon letters on the side of the building saying Salam Alaikum to every traveler who came to this German city. Yeah, so the chimney, the minaret is the smokestack, the chimney. On the left, it's in France, built by the French army for Senegalese Muslim soldiers so that they wouldn't get too homesick. So they built this to look like a mosque from their part of the world. On the right, a Turkish mosque, really unusual. This was also one of those photos where I thought, well, great, you know, I was so delighted to be able to include that. Just because it's, you know, people think about Turkish architecture and it's so well written about and so well documented, but then you find something like this and you think, well, that's extraordinary. This is in Algeria, built by the Abadi community. This was an influence on Le Corbusier, apparently. He visited this place as a young man, and it's considered to have been an influence on his famous masterpiece, the Chapel of Ronchamp. And you can see why, right? The big white surfaces, little window apertures. Photo on the left, it's just a great photo. I mean, it's almost like a photo from Star Wars, right? I mean, it's just so extraordinary. But there's a whole story there as well, which is also in the captions about mosques in the Dogon country, in the Dogon part of Mali. You know, there's lots of stories where you think, well, this needs a bit of academic research. So if there's anybody listening who's studying Islamic architecture, there are so many things that have not been written about yet. You know, if everybody still writes about Iran and Turkey and Egypt and Morocco, but there are so many other areas of the world that really need some proper attention. On the right is in Sudan, so the famous Al-Nilin Mosque, but then there was also a little mini version of that made in Khartoum for the Blue Nile Sailing Club, which also I think is just such a charming story. I also wanted to do contemporary architecture. I didn't want to just limit to history, but also to now. So on the left is in Riyadh, designed by Zaha Hadid. On the right, designed by the famous modernist architect Louis Kahn, the prayer hall in Bangladesh. Then on the right, so Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque is well known, of course, but I think, well, what photo can I use that would really be interesting? And Sultan Qaboos Mosque commissioned a number of artists to design these niches in the walkway around the main hall, the main prayer hall. This is one of them, and it's just such a beautiful design, so beautifully executed. So the book was also an opportunity to capture that and to name the artist who made it and all that. In Turkey, amazing building. Lovely photo as well. You know, it just tells a story. I think it's yeah, it's a good one to include. Indonesia and Sumatra, you know, huge building, amazing story as well. You'll have to read it in the book, why it's shaped like it is. But this is also Islamic architecture, right? It looks different, but it certainly is. There was also an opportunity to talk a little bit about, well, heritage under threat. Mosques in Myanmar. Everybody knows about the terrible things that are happening there. So I was happy to find a good photo from one of those mosques, and also to be able to tell a story about that a little bit. And the same with Uyghur mosques. This mosque, Kargalik Mosque, has been knocked down since and been rebuilt at 25% of the size. It's crazy, right? And it's probably only because the Chinese authorities want to be able to say, no, this mosque is still here. But it's like, it's a mini version. I also wanted to include influence of Islamic architecture, of which there are many examples in the UK as well. There really was a period in the 19th century where Moorish revival architecture was very popular, and there were so many examples of that on the left in Dunkirk. But also Islamic architecture being exported to South America via Spain. So this amazing ceiling is in Ecuador. This is in Dallas. Looks like the famous minaret of Samarra, right, in Iraq. So I've really tried to mix it up. I mean, obviously you would expect me to say this. If you want to see more, you just have to buy the book. But the challenge for me was really to make the book a surprise and to make it more than what people were expecting, and to tell stories that people didn't know. So for example, the chapter on Africa, there were so many things that I was able to include from Nigeria, from Ivory Coast, and many other places that have never been documented before. And the reason that can happen now is that because digital cameras are now more affordable, there are more people who are traveling around their own country, photographing buildings and then uploading them to websites like Alamy or Getty so that I can use them. That wouldn't have been possible even 20 years ago. And the cover of the book with the door with the gentleman facing the door, I found on Instagram. I saw the photo. I thought, this is absolutely gorgeous photo. So I sent a message to the Instagram account saying, please tell me you didn't take this with an iPhone, but with a proper camera. And she did. And the lady, the young woman in Egypt who took that photo, ended up sharing the photo. We credited her, of course, and now it's on the cover of this book. So it's a sort of democratization, really, of photography that made this book possible. So that's by way of the photos, and briefly, and I don't want to bang on too much. I also spent a long time making all sorts of illustrations that were also going to go into the book. None of them did. And that's the way it works with books, right? You want to include stuff, but then when it gets to actually deciding how you're going to fill all the pages of the book, some things just have to get chucked out. And I did a lot of illustrations. The two illustrations on the right, for example, are patterns that are on the big marble bowl in the court of the lions of the Alhambra. So there's 8 lions, I think, who are supporting this big big marble dish on their back, which has a fountain, and these are the geometric patterns. The 2 patterns on the left are Mamluk patterns, which I really like. I did Great Seljuk minaret pattern, brick patterns. There's a beautiful square Kufi pattern here, which I analyzed on the right. And then some other things about squares and volumes, which I worked on how to draw a beautiful dome, sorry, not arch. The golden ratio in the architecture in Samarkand. So, the growth of the Cordoba Mosque explained with just a compass and a ruler in the architectural proportions. Anyway, none of this stuff made it into the book, which was for the better. The book is better without it, really. But it's anyway. Hopefully, there's an opportunity to publish this stuff at some other point. Question, does anybody know where this is? I can tell you it's in Wales. It's in Cardiff Castle, of all places, would you believe? Beautiful Muqarnas ceiling. Yeah, Muqarnas is typical three-dimensional Islamic geometric design. So there's lots of examples around the world, around Europe, of Islamic architecture. Bin Laden Mosque in Saudi Arabia. It was very difficult to correctly identify this mosque for some reason. Really, really hard. And then there's a couple of translations already. The big news here is that there's going to be an Arabic translation. So you heard it here first. That's coming out probably at spring next year. So that's very exciting because none of our books have ever been translated into Arabic. So for this now to happen, it's great. And then lastly, I thought, let me show you all the rejected covers. So as I mentioned, as an author for Thames and Hudson, I don't have any say over the cover because it's too important, right? There's a whole sales department and marketing department that choose the cover. So they made all sorts of covers. We tested all sorts. These are all photos from the book, by the way, and there's more. And in the end, we decided with the one we have now, which I think is the right choice. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for fascinating insights and introduction, I'd say, into your work, because I'm sure there's a lot more to unpack if we had more time. But I think this sort of leads us quite nicely on to our sort of question and answer session, where we open the floor to questions, comments, anything that you feel stood out. I mean, one thing that really stood out personally was the fact that you went to certain parts of the world which are, I'd say, lesser known or lesser documented, and also places where Muslims are minorities, whether it's Northern Europe, South America, and what is the characteristics, or what are the characteristics of the architecture there? Does it depend on, that's actually a question to you, Eric, is it primarily driven by where the people originate from, the management committees?
Well, I mean, South America is such an interesting story, because what happened is that, you know, the Spanish went to South America, colonized it, and, you know, we know all the terrible things that they did there, and they wanted to populate these new lands. So the boats that went out to South America, they only wanted Christians to go there. So if you were a Christian living in Spain and you wanted to emigrate to South America, you could. But for the Mudahar artists, so Muslim artists or Muslims living in Spain at the time, who also wanted to go to South America to seek a better life, I guess, they went as stowaways. They would hide on the boat, and that's how they ended up in South America, because the Spanish authorities didn't want Muslims to go there, but they did, and they ended up there. And all these examples that you see of sort of the architecture that you also see in Al-Andalus, the geometric wooden ceilings in churches, but many things. And this is all craftsmen who used to live in Spain, who then went to South America by stealth, and you know, introduced that tradition there. Absolutely extraordinary story.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, I saw something similar in Lima, in Peru, where the central square, there's these balconies, and they have very visible arabesque.
They do, yes.
Architecture. Yeah.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That's right. Yeah, no, there's quite a few countries in South America. You know, it was hard to choose, because there really are some amazing examples that you think, well, you know, that show this story of people bringing their skills to the new world, for lack of a better term.
Fantastic. So we've got a whole bunch of questions that have already come, so I'll sort of try and whiz through some of them. One of them is, why have you pursued this line of work, Eric? I mean, what is the main driver? What really got you to do this?
Hang on, let me just...
Sorry, could someone speaking, would you kindly mute the...
I've already muted. Yes, that was a mistake. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Oh, I can hear all people speaking. Well, Islamic geometric design was my my gateway to Islamic architecture. Really, it's a bit of a spiritual story for me, or a religious story. When I was a young man in Amsterdam, and I really thought, well, what am I here for, right? What's my purpose? Lord, what is my purpose? And Islamic architecture dropped into my heart. I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to write a book about Islamic architecture. And of course, I'm Dutch, so wanting to be a writer in a different language on a topic like that, yeah, that was the dream. That was the dream that was in my heart, and God pushed me told me to go in a particular direction, which was Islamic geometric design. And at the time, that seemed like, well, just a very unsensible choice. Because I didn't know anyone in Amsterdam who did that. For 10 years, it was just me doing my drawings, trying to deconstruct these things and analyze it. But ultimately, you just have to, as we say in the Christian faith, not lean on your own understanding. And I just pursued it, and I thought, okay, this is what I have to do, and I'm not going to give up. And it's been extraordinary for me, because now that I've written this book of Islamic architecture with a great publisher, and it's getting translated into Arabic, it's beyond imagination. So it's not just, oh, this interests me, this is what I'm going to do. It's more, okay, this is what you have to do, and this is what you need to do next. So all I knew were the next steps that I had to take, but not my strategy of these are the things I need to do to write a book for Islamic architecture, because you can't plan these things. You just have to have faith and not give up, I guess.
Yeah, fantastic. It's great that there's that level of spontaneity built into it, because then I think it shows a more natural, holistic kind of view of the subject that you're dealing with. So that's fantastic. Another question is, what specific architectural examples can you think of that serve the natural environment, like wildlife, for example? You've mentioned the use of architecture for bird baths and resting spots for birds. Are there any other examples that you can think of?
No, let me think. I don't know. All the thing that comes to mind is that in Ottoman architecture, if you look around, you'll see examples of this being put into practice, of making these accommodations for smaller living beings. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's a tenet of the Islamic faith, isn't it? That you also have to take care of of all living beings. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was. Can't think of anything at the moment, though. Sorry.
I mean, certainly from a kind of a environmental perspective, and a lot of the masajid, or a lot of the new mosques that have been built, have factored in the need to sort of save on water consumption,
Yeah.
not having too much of a footprint, environmental footprint on the area around. So there are those considerations that have been built in,
Yes.
I mean, certainly in the past, and probably now. Even like the Cambridge Mosque, an example, is a case in point. A beautiful example of how a lot of things have been thought of to try and make sure that the carbon footprint is minimized as much as possible.
Well, that's right. Well, you do have mosques for example, in Uzbekistan, where summers are very hot and winters are very cold, and they do have different spaces that you can use depending on the season, so that they can take advantage of the climate, rather than trying to fight against the climate, if you see what I mean. Where the space you would use in summer is built in a completely different way, than the space you would use in the summer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, another question that's come is, do you think Gaudi from Barcelona got some inspiration from Islamic architecture in Spain? What's your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So there's a photo of Gaudi. Let me have a look. Let me just see if I can find it. Gaudi's in the book. Hang on. The first project he did when he came out of architecture school is an amazing building that's just, hang on, let me see if this is going to work. Oh, here we go. So this is Gaudi. And a building like that with the tiling on the outside and the crenellations and the sort of many arches that are hinted at. He was very much influenced by that. And this whole idea of tiling, of course, is something that he would have seen in Spain as part of the Islamic inheritance, basically in Andalusian architecture. Yeah. Very much influenced, and I think there's even records where he says as much.
Wow, fascinating.
Mm.
Someone's asked whether, I mean, they're asking regarding permissions for sharing photographs in the book. I mean, did you find or did you come across any individuals, any photographers who refused permission for their photos to be included in your book? I mean, did you encounter that?
No, not really refused. I mean, most of the photos that I used are on, I think 80% of the photos that I've used are from photo agencies. So these photos, by definition, I have been uploaded to be used. And that's what photographers want. You know, they want to end up in a book.
Right.
There are some photos, for example, of a cultural complex in Kuwait that uses geometric patterns on the facade. And there's photos of this building, but I came across a really especially beautiful photo that I wanted to have in the book, and I didn't really want anything else. I just wanted that photo. And the photographer is a very known architecture photographer who doesn't even need to upload his photos to photo agency websites because he just does commissions for clients. So and that happened several times. So there was one photo that Turkish mosque with the painted wooden ceiling was done by a photographer who does photographs for World of Interiors. And he went to Turkey for World of Interiors and took those photos. So for us to be able to use that photo, my publisher had to get in touch with World of Interiors and say, look, you know, do us a solid and please let us use this photo. No, but so you need permissions for everyone, for everything. And also with the Egyptian lady whose photo ended on the cover, you know, we send over a contract and it's all 100% legal. But sometimes there's a bit of suspicion, right? Especially if it's, you know, people have bad experiences, right? Of people making a beautiful photo and then it just ending up everywhere. But nobody refused. You know, if you can get your photo in the book by Thames and Hudson, you know, what could be better? So just some photos I really wanted to have, and I just didn't want to settle for anything else. And for those photos, sometimes it was a bit of extra effort, but you know, worth it.
That makes complete sense. Someone who's asked, they're curious to hear your thoughts on how Islamic geometric patterns can be integrated into contemporary architecture. Should they remain as decorative motifs, or do you see them having more of a conceptual, symbolic role in the modern designs?
Well, it's been a bit of a bugbear of mine because geometric patterns are not just a decorative motif, right? I mean, it's traditionally Islamic geometric patterns in the context of architecture are there to not necessarily make the building more beautiful, but to engage with the people who pass by and to invite them to reflect and to take a moment out of the daily busyness of life and to invite them to contemplation. That's really what the purpose is of these patterns, in my opinion. And in contemporary architecture, it's just a bit of visual texture on the side of the building, right? And if you look at any building really from I don't know, from Morocco or Iran or Egypt that has Islamic geometric patterns, quite often you have like 10 or 15 different patterns.
Yeah.
And the idea is also that you see different patterns, you can juxtapose them, If it's a building you walk past every day, there's still new things to look at. In contemporary architecture, they just choose one pattern and they use it to death, basically. And it's a completely different thing. It's a completely different thing, and I find it a shame because the patterns that are used in contemporary architecture, you can count on the numbers on the fingers of two hands. Maybe it's always the same patterns, and there are hundreds of patterns that you could use. But this whole idea of geometric design and architecture are two sides of the same coin. You know, they really go together. And there's so much opportunity in contemporary architecture to use it in a more sophisticated way, in a more profound way as well. You know, not just okay, let's put on a pattern to give it a bit of a certain flavor. It's a different thing. So I wish that it was a bit different. I wrote an ebook a couple of years ago, which sort of addresses this, which is called Best Practice in Islamic Geometric Design, and it sort of looks at how historically what are the do's and don'ts of Islamic geometric design, and how can we apply these things in contemporary architecture. And one of the things is to use different patterns and to, you know, to engage with the people who walk past, so that if you have a very big building, you know, you would still do something at a human level, 2 meters from the ground maybe, to give something to the people who walk past to engage with. That's really best practice.
Oh, fantastic. There's a question regarding the architectural styles associated with Muslim diaspora communities in Northern Europe, or Europe in general, and North America. I mean, what do you see as the current trends? Are the model buildings a continuation of homeland cultures from where people originate, or are they incorporating new styles? I mean, what are you seeing?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, I think I mean, and this is me just throwing a number at it, but I think for every new built mosque in Europe, there's probably 10 primary school conversions. You know, it's the same in the UK, right? A lot of buildings that serve as mosques are buildings that had a different purpose before. So it means the opportunity to really do something with giving it an identity usually happens on the inside rather than the outside. And there's exceptions to that, like Cambridge Mosque, and there's plenty of other examples around Europe as well. I think quite often so if I look, for example, at the new build mosques in Holland, which I know relatively well, you can see by the style whether it's being built for example, the Turkish community or the Moroccan community, right? And that's also what I write about in this chapter in Dutch that I wrote about. So that's a useful thing for people, to Muslims and non-Muslims. You know, if you see a new build mosque which has a very thin, slender minaret, as tall as local building regulations allow, you know, a sort of pencil-like minaret, then you know that that's probably for the Turkish community, or for the Muslims whose heritage, whose parents and grandparents came from Turkey, because it echoes Ottoman architecture. If on the other hand you see new built mosque where the minaret is very blocky or angular, then that's probably a reference to Marinid architecture from Morocco. So there's hints like that which are pretty consistent, you know, barring exceptions. I think on the interiors, I didn't do any interior photos because quite often there's a similar style that's done where well, calligraphy and geometry work together to create the kind of interior space that people conventionally want in a mosque, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess what we find is that if Muslims have been living in even as minorities for a long time, Russia, for example, that the mosque design and the church designs are quite similar. So if you saw the Kul Sharif mosque in Tatarstan, in Kazan, that actually, you know, doesn't look too dissimilar to one of the famous churches that you might see in Moscow, in other parts of.
No, it's true. And look, there's also another mosque in Turkey, in Russia, which it just looks like a church. It really looks like a church. Hang on, let me show you.
Okay.
So
Just
I find
maybe.
that I find that fascinating and extraordinary because it's. I think when you get closer to that particular building, there are, details in the windows and in the doors, and on top of the spire, which I suppose is the minaret, which has a crescent moon on it, which indicates, okay, this is a mosque, but it's not so obvious.
Yeah. I mean, in your book, do you discuss the architecture of the Dome of the Rock in detail, or is that
I
something?
don't. I don't. There's books that do that well.
Did you recommend one?
Oh, let me think. Which one is that? Well, the Ola Grobar, right? Isn't he the one that wrote the fantastic book about that? That's the one to get,
Oh,
I think. Um, it depends how much detail you want. There's a couple of good academic articles. If you go to scholar.google.com, there's a couple of good things on the Dome of the Rock. It's very interesting because I added something about the Dome of the Rock that ultimately I had to take out of the book because we just didn't have enough space, which was about the first instances of pointed arches in Islamic architecture. And the Dome of the Rock, the colonnade around the actual rock, the arches, because the colonnade is so fat, the arches on the outside are just like that, but then the arches closer to the inside are slightly like that, very slightly. And yeah, it just shows you how designers had a design problem to overcome and introduce something that later would become, you know, um, one of Islamic architecture's main legacies, i.e., the pointed arch.
wow. And do you have any views on the sort of pre-Islamic Persian style? I mean, and how that may have influenced Islamic architecture? I mean, what I know it's not something that you focus on necessarily here, but is that something that you have a view on? I mean, how has that impacted Islamic architecture?
Do I have a view on that? Um, I mean, nothing starts in a vacuum, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you look and to sort of take a different approach, if you look at the earliest Umayyad art or architecture of these desert palaces that are in Jordan and in Palestine, you see that the people, the tradesmen, the craftsmen, the builders who built these sort of palaces for their new Umayyad masters were used to previously doing the same, but for their Byzantine masters, right? And
Right.
that they take across quite a few of these skills, but then adapt them to a new reality, which is really quite interesting in itself. And I think also in a different way with pre-Islamic Persian architecture, you have elements like the squinch, the architectural feature where if you have a square room that needs a round dome on top, how do you make that transition nicely? I think that the first example of that was found in pre-Islamic Persian architecture, and there's other examples as well. Um, it's I mean the book generally is about how things influence each other, and it's a theme across millennia, really. If you see how, for example, the photo I showed of that building in Dallas that looks like the minaret of the Great Mosque of Samarra, sort of this twisted ziggurat style thing. I think these influencing these architectures being influenced by previous architecture, that still happens, and that's what makes it all so interesting, I think.
Yeah. So you wouldn't say that there's anything particularly unique that makes Islamic architecture kind of, yeah, kind of separates itself from something like Gothic architecture, where there are certain characteristic
I
features?
do. I mean, I love Islamic architecture more than any other other style. And what I love is the exuberance and the love for detail and the creativity. It's just and that's what I wanted to show in this book as well. That it's not just the things that we know. The sort of the Persian style mosque or buildings that look like the Taj Mahal, or the Mamluk buildings in Cairo, but there's so much else beyond that. So much else beyond that, and the freedom that people have within a design tradition to really be creative. So, for example, that column that I showed from Diyarbakir, for example, which is sort of like all knotted and twisted. I think, well, how did that work? If you try and imagine that process, right? So you're the builder who's building this mosque for an Ottoman sultan in Diyarbakir. You're building a mosque and you think, okay, actually this column, I could make this column more interesting. I'm going to give myself a lot more work, but I think it's worth it. First, you have to explain what you want to do to your boss. Then your boss has to explain it to his boss, and then you have to execute it really well, and for what, just so you could make it more beautiful. And I think there are so many examples like that in Islamic architecture, where people, did the opposite of take a shortcut, but really thought, well, how can we honor, Allah's love for beauty, God's creation, by adding beauty into this building. I mean, every single building in Islamic architecture is testament to that in different ways. That's what's great. That's what's amazing, and that's true for buildings from 1,000 years ago and buildings from 50 years ago. I think that still continues. So that's what makes it exceptional, in my opinion.
I suppose going forward, would you say that there's still room today for creation of new patterns within Islamic traditions? I mean, I guess this is a live space. I mean, it's not the end.
Yeah, I mean, new patterns, it's yes, in a way, but I think so. For example, if I tell ChatGPT, design me an Islamic geometric pattern, it just creates a mess. It's just not good. And the reason is that there's do's and don'ts in Islamic geometric design, right? It's not everything goes, and there are constraints within which there is creativity. And when I first started doing Islamic geometric design, I thought, oh, let's see if I can design some new patterns. It's really hard, right? All the best ones have been done already, and it's hard to make something that works. I think the opportunities are not. There are so many patterns that could be used, right? I think the challenge for architects is not even so much can we design new patterns, because it really requires a lot of experience to be able to do that well. It's more, how can we use new technologies to use these patterns in a way that was previously not possible. So, for example, the thing I did in Dewsbury, this big composition, we could only do it this big because we could use water jet cutting, right? Because if you had to make tiles that big by hand, it would just be really hard to do. And I think generally there's lots of opportunities where new manufacturing processes, new design technologies allow you to be creative with these patterns in new ways. That's where the exciting challenges are, I think. Not so much can I design a new pattern, but can I take an existing pattern and do something new with it?
Right. And I suppose there's also the functional aspects. Someone's asking, have you come across any mosques that make use of solar panels, wind turbines, other sorts of modern technologies that can help to make the management of the mosque more efficient, but also just to sort of add another facet to it that we're not familiar with.
I'm sure they exist. I mean, you have to understand that this book, I wrote it during the pandemic, right? So the only traveling I did was in my head, basically. And even traditionally, there are design traditions in Islamic architecture that harness the power of ventilation and wind, right? So that's not a new thing. It's just we're doing it in different ways. I would expect. I think certainly the mosque in Cambridge is designed with certain standards of sustainability and such. And I know of examples of buildings that have been designed recently where you can see how this has been designed to take into consideration, the hot summers, for example, that this building is built in. I think there's more there's awareness of that. But I mean, that's been the case for centuries, right? I mean, mosques that were built in Iran, or like I said, in Uzbekistan, they were built with a understanding of what was needed to make them agreeable spaces and pleasant spaces to be in. So but to answer the question, do I know of mosques that use solar panels and wind turbines? No, I don't, but that doesn't mean that they aren't there. I'm sure they're there. I just haven't come across them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's a couple of more questions before we start rounding up. One of them is, do you have any books that you'd recommend other than the one that you published on Islamic art and architecture? Anything else that you would say, yes, this is a good one that I feel would be a good primer, or takes you on a particular journey, which would be something that I'd recommend?
There's a few. Oh my goodness. So, which publisher is that?
If they don't come to mind now, you can always send it to us and we can share it.
I will. I'll do that. I'll do that, and you can share it, because there are a couple of books that I really rate, and that I've used a lot in the past. Yeah. Let me do that.
Brilliant. Are there any other thoughts, any questions, anything that stood out from this particular trip, this particular talk on Islamic architecture? I mean, there was one comment about the expansion sketches from Cordoba, and the question is, do you believe that Islamic architecture has a deep connection with geometry and mathematics? What's your feeling?
Yeah, I think so. The Cordoba thing is a good example. Hang on, let me just see if I can bring this thing back up. Let's see if I can go back. Here we go. Yeah, so the picture on the left is Cordoba, and phase one, this is Cordoba initially, where it was just a square in 785, and then they need to make it bigger. Can you guys see my mouse, my cursor? Yeah, so I needed to make it bigger. How did they do that? They took a circle or an arc, and they drew an arc, and this gave them a new volume, and this is a √2 rectangle. And then subsequently they added more volume, another arc here, making it a √3 rectangle. All these things are super interesting, I think, and I'm trying to figure out, I'm working on the next book, which is about this, actually, about two things: about the fact that patterns and architectural design are two sides of the same coin, but also about the square and √2 proportions, because there are so many patterns, especially in Morocco and Al-Andalus. Almost all the patterns can all be derived, or can all be traced back to the humble square. And there's a whole book to be written about that, if I can do it in a good way, in an accessible way, about how just by playing with a compass and a ruler, architects were able to, for example, do these Cordoba mosque expansions, and it doesn't mean you have to do any calculations. It just needs to know that you need to know how to change volumes, or how to use a compass to create a new rectangle, basically.
Yeah.
So it's there's a book in there somewhere. So I'm just trying to figure out with my publisher what kind of book that would be. Would it be another big fat coffee table book, or would it be a little book? I don't know yet. Let's see.
Right. And one final question before we round up is regarding the Pink Mosque in the Philippines. Do you have a bit of a story to tell us about that? I mean,
yeah, it's not a good story though.
Oh no.
So the Pink Mosque in the Philippines is in a part of the Philippines that has a lot of crime, a lot of drug-related crime, and the painting of the mosque was made possible by a local politician / person of influence who later died. And they paid for this mosque to be painted pink. They wanted this region of the Philippines that was only ever in the newspapers for bad reasons to be in the newspapers for good reason. And pink, according to this politician's wife, was the color of love and peace. And That's that's what they painted it pink. Yeah, but it's let me get this photo out. When I first came across this, I was just amazed at this evening that this existed. Let me look. It's such an amazing building. There we go. Yeah.
Wow.
And it's not just, it's proper hot pink, isn't it?
Yeah, there's something almost Disney-like about it, that the sort of
That's right. Yeah, no, really, it's just so extreme. Apparently the whole village is painted pink, not just the mosque.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Eric, it's been a truly captivating talk on Islamic architecture and how you've shown that, architecture, art, geometry, spirituality, all these things sort of weave themselves together beautifully. And it's not just photos for the sake of it. I mean, it's the stories behind it, the interactions between people and buildings, like that the Haji Habib Masjid in Ethiopia in the Afar region. That one, you wouldn't know what that's about and what efforts have gone in to produce that mosque and the challenges
No,
that people
exactly.
feel. The Tobacco Mosque in Dresden, this Pink Mosque. So yeah, every mosque or every piece of Islamic architecture or architecture in general has a story behind it, and I'm really glad that you've kind of brought that to life and inspired us to also look at the stories that kind of underpin these beautiful pieces of architecture. So
Thank you.
yeah,
It was a privilege for me to write the book. It really was.
yeah.
It's that this would fall to me is still something that I marvel at. But there we are.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, without further prolonging the event, I know we've gone over slightly. I'll hand back to Katarzyna, who will close. But thanks from my side anyway. Thank you to Eric, and thanks to everyone for participating and all your kind of thoughtful comments and questions. And we look forward to continuing this at another appropriate time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating, absolutely fascinating event. I was just trying to go onto ChatGPT to try to do what you said to see what it's going to produce, but they've changed a little bit the link, so I need to go back and check. And I'm actually going to try that with few others AI programs because I didn't know about it. I know there are limits. But yeah, I'm gonna do that.
Okay.
Before we go away, I could not stop for a moment listening today. And I completely forgot to let everybody know about the upcoming events. There's still a few. So a live event celebrating at the Lowry on Saturday, 21st of June. Tickets are limited, so if you can come, please do. It's at the Lowry in the studio in Salford. The tickets are on Eventbrite as usual. Then we've got also an online event, International Youth Speak Out on Environment on Sunday, 22nd of June. And we've got an event that was not showing up earlier. It's remembering Srebrenica. It's the 30 years memorial event. Kezra Shiraz, MACFEST director, organizer of all these wonderful events, and the founder of MACFEST and Muslim Women's Arts Foundation, is going to be co-hosting this event. It's on Wednesday, 25th of June. Yes, so before we close, another reminder, we are still accepting the submissions for Muslim Arts Awards. So if you are a creative or an artist and your artwork would fit in one of the 4 categories, drawing, painting, calligraphy, or photography, you can submit your works for free, up to 2 different artworks through MACFEST website. So thank you very much for today. It was lovely to see you. Thank you.